the iron escalation, Trump, Middle East war, and the specter of American doom on home soil. Welcome, viewers, to the Strategic Analysis channel, where we strip bare the ugly truths about power and geopolitics. I am John Mearsheimer, and today we will dissect the successive tragedies, the undeniable warning signs of a collapsing global power structure, and the steep price the American people are paying for the strategic blindness of the Washington elite. Look closely at what has just transpired. From the horrifying mass shooting at a Hanukkah celebration in Sydney, Australia, to the student massacre at Brown University right here on American soil, and the uncontrollable escalation of violence in the Middle East, these are all pieces of a single puzzle. Instability is spreading, not just as international conflict, but as a decay from within nations, especially the United States. What are Americans truly afraid of? They fear the government's impotence in protecting them, afraid that the dollar is buying too many bombs abroad and cannot buy safety for their children in the classroom. Let us begin with the coldest contrast, the stark dichotomy in security that I have long warned about, the difference between the United States and the rest of the world. The Sydney shooting, where a 50-year-old father and his 24-year-old son shot dead 15 people and injured 42 others, is a horrific tragedy, the deadliest attack in Australia since the Port Arthur massacre in 1996. It is a massive shock to a nation that takes gun security for granted. But let us shift our gaze to Rhode Island. At Brown University, a gunman killed 2 students and injured 9 others. This is the 389th mass shooting in the United States this year, according to the Gun Violence Archive. 389, write that number down, 389. It is not just a statistic, it is a strategic admission of failure. Even a survivor like Mia Tretta, who was shot while in high school, says the words, "never again" after every shooting have ceased to mean anything. She rightly states, "It feels like America is the only country that takes gun violence and shootings as a fact of life, and it doesn't have to be." Why doesn't it have to be? Because gun violence is not a law of nature, it is a product of political and social structure. While the elite in Washington are preoccupied with pursuing so-called liberal hegemony, that is, reshaping the world in their image by intervening in Ukraine, sanctioning Venezuela, or attempting to contain China, they are utterly neglecting the most basic duty of any realist government, providing security for its own citizens. The consequence is that the American people not only face the risk of being drawn into a major war abroad, but also the risk of being shot dead while attending college, shopping at the grocery store, or even watching a movie. Domestic insecurity is the clearest manifestation that the United States' resource allocation and strategic priorities have gone disastrously wrong. And this is what John Mearsheimer always emphasizes. A great power cannot maintain its international standing if it cannot uphold order and stability in its own backyard. The evidence is clear. While Americans mourn mass shootings, their rivals are acting with greater resolve, and U.S. allies are increasingly doubting Washington's capability and sanity. Let us turn our gaze to the Middle East, the testing ground for American foreign policy failure. Here, the ferocious escalation of tension is warning of a larger war, a real danger, not just empty threats. In Syria, 3 Americans, including 2 soldiers and their interpreter, were killed in an ISIS attack in Palmyra. These are the first U.S. casualties in Syria since the regime of Bashar al-Assad was toppled a year ago. President Donald Trump's reaction is to vow retaliation against ISIS. This sounds strong, but look at the bigger picture. The Pentagon is reducing U.S. troop numbers in Syria from 2,000 to about 1,000 today. This is an ambiguous strategic move, typical of a retreating superpower attempting to project toughness. From an offensive realist perspective, the withdrawal is logical because Syria is not a core interest, it is a strategic trap dug by the liberal hegemons themselves. But withdrawing troops while simultaneously announcing forceful retaliation creates ambiguity about intent, allowing rivals like Iran, Russia, and even ISIS to misunderstand or underestimate U.S. commitment, thereby increasing the risk of escalation. What are the consequences for the American people? Every time Trump announces retaliation, it means the people will have to pay billions more for airstrikes and troop deployment, while the reduced presence increases the likelihood of a retaliatory terrorist attack on the U.S. This is the tragedy of a foreign policy torn between strategic retrenchment and the elite's interventionist impulse. The problem is far worse in the Gaza Strip, where the fragile U.S. brokered ceasefire is on the brink of collapse, and the risk of all-out war is a palpable reality. Hamas has confirmed the death of senior commander Raid Saad in an Israeli strike, along with 3 other Palestinians. This assassination prompted Hamas's chief negotiator to warn that it threatens the viability of the truce and called on President Trump to ensure Israel complies with its terms. But who is truly breaking the agreement? Gaza's government media office reports Israel has violated the U.S. brokered ceasefire terms at least 738 times since it took effect. 738 times! This number is not just a violation, it is an outright disregard for the U.S.'s mediating role. Simultaneously, Israel is severely restricting shipments of food, shelter, medicine, fuel, and other basic goods into Gaza, an act that, from a geopolitical perspective, only fuels more resentment and ensures that the violence will continue with greater intensity. Worse still, Israel's Security Cabinet has approved plans to formally recognize 19 illegal settlement outposts in the occupied West Bank, outposts that are illegal even under Israeli law. Media reports indicate this plan was pushed by far-right cabinet member Bezalel Smotrich and coordinated in advance with the Trump administration. This is a strategic move aimed at cementing a system of annexation, apartheid, and the full Judaization of Palestinian land, as condemned by the Palestinian Colonization and Wall Resistance Commission. For Mearsheimer, this is the core of the American liberal hegemony problem. Washington cannot execute a fair or stabilizing foreign policy because it is too closely bound to the specific interests of one allied nation, even when those interests violate international law and increase regional instability. What does this mean for the American people? This policy guarantees that the United States will remain bogged down in the Middle East. Unconditional security commitments to Israel, reinforced by this coordination with the Trump administration, mean the American people will continue to fund an endless conflict. The consequence is that billions of American tax dollars are diverted from domestic infrastructure projects, from healthcare, from education, to support a policy that is fundamentally unstrategic and increases the future risk of a major war. When we speak of escalation, we cannot overlook a classic example of American gunboat diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere, an action that raises tensions with smaller adversaries and erodes U.S. international prestige. The U.S. Coast Guard seized the oil tanker Skipper near Venezuela. The tanker was reportedly carrying nearly 2 million barrels of Venezuelan oil destined for the Cuban port of Matanzas. The seizure warrant was obtained under federal law authorizing the U.S. government to seize assets engaged in planning or perpetrating any federal crime of terrorism. This occurred as the New York Times reported the seized oil tanker was part of the Venezuelan government's effort to support Cuba. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel's reaction was to condemn the act as this return to gunboat diplomacy, this threatening diplomacy, the scandalous theft, one more in the already long list of looting of Venezuelan state assets. From a realist standpoint, The U.S. is using its naval power to punish smaller nations pursuing an independent foreign policy, which Washington views as a threat to its regional hegemony. The use of counterterrorism language to legalize the seizure of oil is a serious strategic distortion of language, giving rivals like Russia and China more reason to criticize and seek ways to counter U.S. coercion. And this is what the American people need to understand. These actions do not make the U.S. safer. They risk sending the price of gasoline for Americans skyrocketing, and simultaneously, we are pushing nations like Venezuela and Cuba into the arms of our greater rivals, China and Russia. The leaders in Beijing and Moscow are not fools. They see this unnecessary aggression and conclude that the U.S. is not a reliable partner, but a regional bully that needs to be contained. That is why the retirement of Admiral Alvin Halsey, the U.S. military commander who oversaw the Pentagon's attacks on boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean, carries significant strategic weight. The U.S. provided no evidence backing claims the boats were used for drug trafficking. In the context of escalating tensions, the lack of transparent evidence for such military actions only erodes U.S. soft power and increases international skepticism. As we analyze global movements, let us look to more distant lands, where power shifts are underway. In Chile, the election of far-right candidate José Antonio Cast as president is a clear sign of a global political trend toward hardline populism, a reaction against the failure of liberal models. Cast vowed to crack down on crime and immigration and called for a mass deportation campaign. He even praised the U.S.-backed military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, saying if he were alive, he would vote for me. From Mearsheimer's perspective, the rise of far-right leaders like Cast in Chile or Trump in the U.S. is not accidental. It is a direct response to the economic inequality and the loss of cultural identity caused by the liberal globalization that the U.S. has championed. People in Latin America, like people in the U.S., are looking for a strong leader who promises to put national interests first and restore domestic order. Now, let us turn to the Asia-Pacific region, where escalating tensions between China and the West threaten a major war that many Americans are trying to ignore. In Hong Kong, media tycoon and pro-democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai was convicted of colluding with foreign governments under Beijing's sweeping national security law and faces life imprisonment. His family expressed alarm over his deteriorating health while jailed in solitary confinement. At the same time, Hong Kong's last major opposition party, the Democratic Party, officially disbanded under pressure from Chinese authorities. The party's former chairwoman, Emily Lau, said, "The current political environment is getting worse and worse. The Democratic Party is on the verge of disappearing." For Mearsheimer, this is a clear example of how a rising regional power, China, asserts territorial control and crushes internal threats. Beijing is acting according to the logic of realism, maximizing power and security by eliminating external interference and separatist threats. The conviction of Jimmy Lai and the dissolution of the Democratic Party send a chilling message to Washington. The U.S. cannot protect liberal values or its smaller allies when confronted by an adversary with the determination and geographical power of China. America's impotence in preventing this erodes its credibility in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, and increases the future risk of war, as these nations will have to ask themselves if Washington is willing to sacrifice to defend them. And when we talk about President Trump's involvement in global economic and political shifts, consider his action regarding Belarus. Belarus released 123 political prisoners, including Nobel Peace Prize winner Alas Belyatsky and leading opposition figure Maria Kolesnikova, immediately after the Trump administration announced it would lift sanctions on Belarusian potash. President Trump's envoy, John Cole, said about 1,000 political prisoners remaining in Belarus could be released in the coming months. This is a transactional foreign policy move entirely consistent with Trump's America First philosophy. It is a cold power exchange, freedom for prisoners in exchange for economic benefits for the US and perhaps a strategic pulling of Belarus out of Russia's orbit. While critics might view this as compromise with a dictator, Mearsheimer sees it as a pragmatic act. Trump is using economic leverage to achieve a specific political goal, the release of people without resorting to military intervention or pursuing a costly liberal crusade. However, the risk is that this sanction removal could undermine the broader effort to isolate dictatorial regimes and once again cause dissatisfaction among America's European allies who may see this as a betrayal of democratic values. Now, we must return to home soil and delve into America's internal issues, where the roots of global instability are sprouting. The content related to Mr. Donald Trump needs to be analyzed with greater depth and detail. First, the issue of immigration and racial profiling. Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar said her son was pulled over by federal immigration agents and asked to provide proof of his U.S. citizenship. This incident came just one day after she warned her son to be careful in parts of Minneapolis with large Somali American populations whom President Trump recently described in a racist tirade as garbage. Omar stated they are racially profiling. They are looking for young men who look Somali that they think are undocumented. This is not just a social issue, it is a geopolitical and power issue. When a president uses inflammatory language and federal law enforcement agencies act based on racial profiling, it sends a powerful message to the world. The U.S. is fractured. The U.S. is not the beacon of liberal values it claims to be. What is the consequence for the American people? For Somali Americans, this means living in fear and being treated as second-class citizens by their own government. For the American economy, this creates instability in the workforce and erodes trust in institutions, which is critically important for economic and political stability. This deep social division, stoked from the highest level of government, undermines America's ability to unite in a major crisis. And that is what America's adversaries are counting on. In a related incident in a Minneapolis suburb, a man and woman are facing charges of assaulting a federal officer after they drove away with a Homeland Security investigations agent in the passenger seat of their car following an immigration stop. The situation escalated when the agent reportedly pointed a gun at the driver. This scenario, where citizens and federal law enforcement violently confront each other, is a clear symptom of the erosion of trust in authority and the escalation of domestic violence. It reflects a nation in a state of near civil tension where routine interactions can quickly become deadly. Second, the link between power and corruption. The release of dozens of photographs by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee showing serial sex offender Jeffrey Epstein with high-profile celebrities and politicians, including former President Bill Clinton and President Donald Trump, is a chilling reminder of the moral rot among the American elite. 3 photos show Trump, including one where he appears next to Epstein at a Victoria's Secret event in 1997. These photos, selected from a cache of over 95,000 from Epstein's estate, are not just gossip. They are visual evidence of the morbid intersection between political power, economic wealth, and moral depravity. Mearsheimer has always argued that domestic power distribution is a strong driver of international behavior. When the elite are morally compromised and distracted by personal scandals, the nation's strategic focus and coherence suffer. The American people fear that their leaders, the ones making decisions about war and peace, are compromised and being manipulated by morally questionable individuals. This loss of trust undermines the consensus needed for any effective foreign policy. Third, the abuse of state power for personal gain. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is suing to block President Trump from constructing a 90,000 square foot ballroom at the White House. The lawsuit states, no president is legally allowed to construct a ballroom on public property without giving the public the opportunity to weigh in. What is truly important here is not the ballroom itself, but who is funding it. Trump's $300 million ballroom is being funded by individuals and corporations that include Amazon, Lockheed Martin, and Palantir Technologies. This is the perfect confluence of the three factors I always warn about: political power, economic finance, and the military industrial interest. Lockheed Martin is a major defense contractor. Palantir is a surveillance and data analytics technology company, and Amazon is the technology behemoth. Their funding of a president's personal project, despite public scrutiny rules, creates a network of interests that fundamentally undermines democracy and distorts strategic decisions. For the American people, this means their foreign and economic policies risk being dominated by private interests buying favor from the president. Decisions about manufacturing fighter jets or deploying surveillance technology are no longer based on national interest but on personal patronage. The consequence is that the people will have to pay for a military equipped with outdated or overly expensive technology just to satisfy the president's donors. All these points, from the uncontrollable gun violence at Brown University to Israel's disregard for the U.S. brokered truce to the moral and financial decay in Washington, all point to a single harsh truth: the United States is on the path of a declining superpower, one that is self-destructing from within. The final event, the near mid-air collision between a JetBlue Airways pilot and a U.S. military aircraft taking off from Curacao and heading toward Venezuelan airspace, is a perfect metaphor for the lack of discipline and the recklessness in the execution of U.S. foreign policy. The military aircraft headed for Venezuelan airspace. A zone of tension was operating so dangerously that it nearly caused a civilian air disaster. This is not just carelessness, it is a lack of control in executing military operations backed by the Trump administration's strategic ambiguity. Now, we must talk about war. I am not a fan of prophecy, but I am a realist, and realism looks at structure. The current power structure is creating instability and increasing the risk of major war. 1. Middle East tension, with Israel formally recognizing 19 illegal settlements, coordinated with Trump and the continuous violation of the ceasefire, the Gaza war is almost certain to escalate into a broader regional conflict, drawing in Iran and its proxies. If Trump retaliates against ISIS in Syria, it will create a new cycle of violence. The American people need to recognize that the lack of balance in U.S. Middle East policy will drag the U.S. into another war, costing thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. The risk of war between the involved nations, especially Israel and Iran, is likely to occur in the near future. 2. The collapse of democracy in Hong Kong is a warning. Beijing will not stop there. Their next target is Taiwan. And America's impotence in preventing the Jimmy Lai case suggests Washington may not be willing to sacrifice to defend Taiwan. This increases the risk that China will miscalculate and believe they can act. The risk of a direct military confrontation in the Taiwan Strait is real, a potential war that could shake the global economy and require the full mobilization of the American military. 3. Western Hemisphere tension. America's gunboat diplomacy toward Venezuela and Cuba is an unnecessary provocation. It risks creating a refugee crisis or a small naval confrontation that could quickly escalate, especially if Russia or China decide to intervene to protect their interests. Donald Trump, with his transactional philosophy and unpredictability, is both the underminer of America's liberal commitments and the creator of strategic chaos, his actions, whether lifting sanctions on Belarus or supporting Israeli settlement expansion, are cold power calculations, but they are executed within a domestic context that is divided and morally decayed. What the American people fear is the combination of domestic instability, uncontrolled gun violence, government-stoked racial profiling, high-level corruption, and the risk of unnecessary war abroad. They fear that the United States, under the leadership of people distracted by scandal and personal gain, will no longer be capable of dealing with the geopolitical challenges ahead. I, John Mearsheimer, urge you to look squarely at the truth. Realism is a harsh lens, but it is the only lens that allows us to see the world as it truly is, a place where power is supreme and domestic safety is the prerequisite for national greatness. The United States is losing both. Do not let sensational headlines, the noise of personal scandals, distract you from the big strategic movements. The decline of American hegemony, the rise of a determined China, and the return of great power conflict. What you need to do is grasp this reality and push for action toward a stable economic, political, and social future, where the government focuses on security at home before pursuing illusions of reshaping the world. This means the people must demand the government withdraw from unstrategic security commitments, stop wasting national wealth on foreign interventions, and comprehensively address gun violence and social division. The consequence may be a temporary retreat from the role of world policeman, but that is the necessary price to restructure internal strength and prepare for the inevitable great power confrontations of the future. Heed this warning. The situation is intensely tense, and the specter of war is looming. Thank you for listening to this sharp analysis. Be sure to tune in for our next videos on this channel, where we will continue to strip bare the ugly truths about the global power structure